Hey guys, welcome back to our Azure Pipelines journey. In my last video, we built on the pipeline that used our containerized agents. We evolved the pipeline from a simple one to variable sharing between jobs and stages, and even looked at matrix deployments. Today, we're taking it a bit further. We'll explore pipeline templates. Think of them as recipe cards that you can reuse across different kitchens. By the end of this video, you'll understand how to structure maintainable pipelines using templates. So let's dive right into the gotchas, the fixes, and the power of templates. When you think of the pipeline templates, think of recipe cards. You write the recipe once, like how to deploy an application, then use that same recipe in different kitchens. Think of you've got a dev kitchen, you've got a test kitchen, and prod kitchen. Each of these kitchens might have different ingredients, or in our case, there'll be variables, but the cooking process stays the same. There are two types of templates I'll be showing you: stage templates and variable templates. So why do we want to use templates for stages? Simple. You avoid copy-paste duplication and you avoid mistakes. Change the deployment process once and it updates everywhere. No more hunting around for 15 different pipelines or stages or jobs that say the same thing. Then we go on to using templates for variables. Why would you use that? Managing environment-specific settings becomes difficult over time, and as the number of variables that you manage grow, you have variable sets for different environments. And so far, we've been using Azure Pipelines library variable groups for this. Let's quickly look at the pipelines library. And you can see you can easily update these values to AP Southeast 1. Save that. And that's it. However, the only information that you can find about this variable group is when it was last modified. It's modified just now or yesterday or a few months ago, but you don't know what variable has been updated and whether it was a deletion of a variable or a change, and what was the previous value before the change. As you can see, it's not easy to track down the changes. We want to manage variables as part of the source code and leverage all the good stuff that comes with DevOps frameworks, like having unlimited undos and tracking the history of variables. Templates solve the fundamental problem of pipeline maintenance. Without them, you're constantly updating the same logic in multiple places, and inevitably you'll miss one. Let's start with the last pipeline we did in our last video. We have these two stages, the acquire credentials and the sequential matrix deployment. So each stage, we've defined all the steps within that stage in this pipeline. When it came to the sequential matrix deployment, where we deploy to multiple environments, we've used the matrix deployment strategy to be able to define the job specifications once. The steps here were all defined once, and we were able to deploy to two environments, our dev and prod environments. Let's look at this pipeline 8. I've said it's broken to show you what I've done wrong and how I was able to fix that. So first, with the acquire credentials stage, you can see the syntax has changed. Instead of the stage name, after the definition of the stage's paragraph, we now define each stage by calling on the name of the template and the file name. So this template's / is the folder where the template file resides. So in our case, we have the templates folder and the stages folder where we're calling the acquire credentials. So let's open that to the side so we can compare. And if I expand this, you can see we're using parameters. Think of the parameters section like blank fields on a form when you call this template and you fill in those blanks. So this is the template, acquire credentials. So we can see both files in a bigger screen. Looking on your left, you see the parameters with the name of the parameter and the value that we're passing to this acquire credentials template. On the template itself, we have defined the parameters, what type of parameter it is, whether it's a string, it can be an object, it can be Boolean, and we have default values that we can define here as well. So that if I don't define this in the parameters on my pipeline, it will just use the default value. And this is where all the definition for our jobs are defined in. It's the same thing as what we had in our pipeline 7, where we have all these steps defined, downloading of the secure file, and finally getting and setting the temporary credentials, saving that into a variable, which is exactly what we did in pipeline 7. So let's test this pipeline. That's good. The first step, the first stage, successful. Second stage, which is deploying to our dev environment, successful. While it's running that, let's go and have a quick look at the deploying to the environments. So our pretend environment, we have a development and a production environment. And I know already that it will successfully deploy to the development environment, but fail in the prod environment. In each environment, we have the parameters defined. Then we have the deployment template being called on by each environment. And we define a different set of parameters like environment name and so forth. So here we can see our dev environment deployed successfully, but when we got to the prod environment, it failed. It errored with error when retrieving credentials. Now this gives us a clue, because if we look at the previous step of the pre-deployment validation for prod, look at this. Credentials expire at. If we compare that to the same step in the dev environment, pre-deployment validation was successfully gave us a value for when those credentials will expire. I'll track down the stage for that validation. We can see that we're printing to the host the value of this variable AWS expiration. If I search for that, I can see that we get it from this variable definition here, where we're already familiar with the syntax of using dollar square brackets, stage dependencies, then the name of the stage, acquire credentials, get credentials is the name of the job. The word outputs, extract credentials is the name of the task or the step. Let's go and look at our pipeline. Open it to the side, minimize that. Stage name is acquire credentials, but it gets this from the acquire credentials template. Let's open acquire credentials template, minimize that. So acquire credentials is the name of the stage. Then get AWS credentials is the name of the job, which is in the nested template that our parent pipeline has called. So do you see the dependencies there and the mapping? How Azure Pipelines is smart enough to get the variables, the value of the variables through this naming convention. So that is the job name. The word outputs. Extract credentials is actually down here, which is the name of our step, this last step. Our output, where we defined it as variables, is equal to whatever name the variable is, which is, in our case, we are interested in the AWS expiration variable. So this word stage dependencies already gives us a clue. Let's go and look at our test pipeline again. Looking at the dev stage has a depends on, here at line 31, of acquire credentials, which is the previous stage. So we're saying in our deployment template, this deployment template, to use the variable, which is a stage dependency, from this stage called acquire credentials. Now let's compare it with the production environment deployment, which failed to deploy. Again, in this production deployment, we're calling the same template. Our depends on, though, is just depending on the dev deployment. So initially, I thought this would work to have that implicit dependency to the acquire credentials stage, because the dev deployment is already dependent on the acquire credentials. So if I just say to Azure Pipelines to depend on dev deployment, then I was thinking that I was going to inherit that same variable that the previous stage has calculated or has obtained. The fix here is simple but very important. All we needed to do was include the acquire credentials stage and as an explicit dependency of the prod stage. Let's update our pipeline. Great. That worked with the validation of the AWS credentials. It was able to test the AWS CLI commands using the credentials that was obtained from that very first stage. And it waited for dev to complete before it started the prod deployment. Here we can see that prod is able to make AWS CLI commands and calls to my AWS environment using that credential. Looking back at our template, I would like to point out one of the syntax that we use here is this dollar curly brackets, the name parameters or the word parameters dot the name of the parameter itself. This particular syntax means that Azure Pipelines will calculate the value of this particular parameter at compile time. Next, we will move into evolving our pipeline to use variable templates instead of variable groups. Let's update our pipeline to our pipeline 9, which uses variable groups. And as expected, we've ran into this error. The error detected is that it can't find my variables file in this path /templates/stages. It's saying I can't find this file. And if I trace that in my repos, stages, and variables, so it's looking for stages /templates/variables, then to this particular file. Let's investigate. Minimize the acquire credentials, and this is what we're interested in. We've now converted our use of variable groups to a template. So this stage is now calling this template deployment variables. I've named it template broken to be able to show the differences. Let's open that to the side and drill down into the template. You can see this one is variables template, and I've put down the note that this one is broken because of the path resolution. See, it's calling this templates /variables dev variables. So that looks correct because if I look at the path file, it is templates, then variables, then the name of the variables. However, this path is a relative resolution because I didn't put forward slash at the start. It's not an absolute path reference. It means it's relative to where my file was at. So when this pipeline runs, this template stages deployment variables template file is run, it then takes this variable or the value of the parameter variables template. You see this definition here? We're saying use for my variables, use this particular variables, but also use this particular template for my variables template. And when it's running it, it is using the relative path from where my template is. This template, remember, it's located here in templates, stages template, deployment variables. And that explains why when we're trying to run it at compile time, why we're getting this error, that it's looking for my file, my variables file, from template stages and then templates variables again. So that's where it's getting lost. The fix there is, thankfully in hindsight, pretty straightforward and simple. So now I have opened my pipeline 9, which is the fixed one. If we look at the variables template, I've actually made it more modularized now, where I'm calling variables devvar template because I've defined that up here in the variables. Devvar template is this, so it's the same as the broken one, but the difference now is in my stage template, where it is now using, instead of just this syntax, I just put a forward slash in front so that it's using that absolute path. So it doesn't care where my stage template file location is. So it's not relative to where my stage template location is. It tells you where it should be picking it up, regardless of where my stage template file is located. Updating the pipeline. While that's deploying, I'll just quickly run through further changes I've made. So I mentioned I've made into variables in my pipeline the location of my dev variable template, the location of my prod variable template. I've also defined in here as a global variable everything from this template file, which is my dev var template, because I didn't want to create another, just a global set of variables for acquiring of the credentials. In the real world, when you're deploying to different environments, you'd have different set of credentials. Lastly, where my deployment template file is located. When I'm calling the first template of acquire credentials, I'm not even defining here what the variables to use is because it's already getting it from this global variable definition. So it knows when it's using the acquire credentials template and running the steps in there, it'll try to look for the variables from this template. When we're running the deployments to the environments with the templates, notice I'm using that same syntax of compile time for calling of the variables as the parameters that we've seen previously. But in this bash step of development environment setup, you can see I've used a different syntax, which is the runtime syntax. To be able to use runtime syntax, it needs to be within the script itself. And this is a script, a bash script that I'm running within the step. Let's look at the development environment setup step. Okay, so our pipeline has run successfully. Looking at that environment. Okay, so this is our script, and we're expecting to see the values of these particular variables to be displayed and printed when we're in that step. And it's correctly calling the dev variables YAML template and its location, knows about the environment being dev, compare that to prod for that specific step. It is correctly resolving that variable value into the expected value of prod. So let's recap what we learned. We learned about stage dependencies. When we're using stage dependencies, make sure our stage actually depends on the target stage. Indirect dependencies or implicit ones, they break the variable access. Second, it's template types. Variable templates centralize the configuration where we have our variables stored as part of our source code, and we have our pipeline templates to eliminate code duplication. Both of them, they solve maintenance headaches. We also learned about template structure. Parameters are your input form, variables and stages are your output. The syntax of the dollar curly brackets, it happens at compile time, whereas the other one with the dollar and normal brackets happens at runtime. So why does this all matter? Templates are not just about being clever with YAML. They're about building pipelines that your team can actually maintain 6 months from now. When you need to add a security scan or change deployment regions, you update one template instead of hunting through dozens of pipeline files. I hope you learned how to use templates and adopt them in your pipeline development next time. In my next video, I plan to look into caching and persistent storage for the Docker agents, and then probably look into more advanced template patterns, including conditional deployments, template composition, and maybe secrets in Key Vault. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.